Well, welcome everybody. Thanks for joining. So we're going to start off with a fireside chat with Anish to discuss what are X risks and how we should approach them. You know, I think we've been discussing during the programming and outside. Whether consciously or more unconsciously about the different sort of risks. But this particular risk seems to pose, risks to entire humanity in a way that we might not be able to come back. So I guess it's important to consider that factor in this whole defensive acceleration mindset that we are trying to be in here today. Just some logistical stuff. So the privacy line here shows that there is a recording taking place. So if you're asking questions, feel free to come here and take my spot and have the discussion. We want it to be very open and not just two people talking. So it's a fireside chat with no fire and with everybody else here. So I'll just start off with some basic elements, and then you guys can jump in with your questions, and hopefully, we'll have some collective understanding of X risk and maybe some, pathways that we can take even in the hackathons that we are all working on. So, thanks Anish for joining us. I think first question is very basic. What about these sort of risks that makes it existential in nature? What is the real threat here? Can you help maybe set the base first with the definition of X risks?
Yeah, so I'll try my little best. I wouldn't go around claiming I am the guy who could write the rules for the game. There have been lots of people that have been trying to do this. So I'm going to borrow from Tony Hall. So he gave a series of talks in Oxford a few years ago, good few years ago now. And he tried to map this problem, right? He can think about impact in one dimension and how long the impact would last in that sense. And if you were to have a two-dimensional graph, the top right of this graph is where what I would describe as existential risk would happen, which is essentially that if you were to start a graph like this, where 0, 0 is low risk and just immediate, and this way is time, as in terms of who is going to be affected, generate, you, your children, grandchildren, humanity. This way. This is the impact. Okay, they will have, this nothing will be affected. You will have a sneeze, this way. When you get here, you're absolutely dead. So if you go here, this is the place where the class of existential risk exists, right? So humanity is expected, and we are all gone. So that's how I would be easily described. For all people who are visual thinkers, that's the way I would describe it. So problems that are having significant impact that are going to have impact on everybody. At that point in time, if a decision is made, that decision could literally mean that timeline no longer exists. So our timeline, the human timeline, exists because humans exist. If humans no longer exist, the human timeline doesn't exist. So existential risk, the problems of existential risk could be considered as those problems that could actually make this possibility of human timeline disappear. Hope that gives you a bit of a flavor.
Yeah. Are there examples, historical examples that you could point to where we have been close to such risks, but we have, we went the other way around, so we're still alive? So,
there are near-term examples and long-term examples. The near-term example I would describe, loosely speaking, I wouldn't, this is very controversial, but I should say this in any way, is the COVID-19. So it's you have a virus, and typically viruses infect. When viruses infect, they have an optimization function, which is how many people can infect. If you're a virus, the thing that you want to do is you want to infect as many people as possible, right? And when you have this as many people as possible, you shouldn't really kill your patients, right? If you kill the patients, it will completely be wiped out in that sense, right? Your chance of survival decreases. You won't be infected, and your people who are infected should infect other people. so you have better chance of infecting the whole world, right? That's a game. Your game is infect as many people as possible. So in a scenario where if such a virus, while evolving, just accidentally forgets the fact that you should keep the people who get infected alive, then you have a big problem, right? So we almost had a set of virus that was able to infect a very large number of people, and globally we tried to contain the risk, and I would say we, to a larger degree, have contained the risk, right? This is like the near term. The one that in history that pretty much why we all exist is that one, the one where a very large asteroid apparently hit Earth, right? So dinosaurs were replaced by mammals because dinosaurs were not the most efficient in terms of energy utilization, and mammals were really energy efficient. So this was like two examples of like, okay, this is the one that really, really changed. If you were to go back in my description of the timeline, so dinosaurs, if they had to write books and they had timelines, they would have a AD and a BC and a thing like that, and suddenly their timeline disappeared, right? So we don't have the history of, other than archaeological finds in that sense, right? So I'm loosely speaking, right? But the other one is like, you could think of the COVID as an example where we as humanity misunderstood the risk it poses us, and our reaction wasn't really meant to really get to the levels where we could really contain it. So that's why I would describe it as like a near existential risk kind of a problem. Like if you were to think of it like, imagine it's without a residual one, where somebody engineered a virus to make sure this is the case. Absolutely, that's an existential risk, right? This is like a precursor to an existential risk where we have a virus that infects people, reasonable mortality, we are able to survive. If you were to have like a very, very, very violent, like air spreadable, that really is 100% fatality, that's a massive problem. That would definitely be in the category of existential risk.
Yeah, I guess you gave some clear examples of bio-based health risks. Do you have a particular ranking in mind about other prominent existential risks currently, and how should people think of them? Can you give some examples?
I will put my hand up and say I'm biased. People are biased towards things right? I've worked on some of this existential risk, so I can give you examples as that. So, air was I have a very long interest, and I worked on it, so I can talk about it. I have some interest in the nuclear risk, I can talk about it. Bio, I'm pretty sure you recognize already worked on it. So, like, there are a bunch of them, and then each of them have, how can I say, it's a very difficult challenge to actually rank them in a partial order. Partial order is like, pretty order in that sense. Depending upon the situation, like depending on the day where the president of the US and the president of Russia were to wake up the right side or the wrong side, we might have a different ranking for existential risk. So imagine we consider nuclear risk as an existential risk, which is actually the case, right? That's the challenge we have. It's very variable. There are too many factors that are factored in. It's very hard for us to really objectively, assess something. And there will always be some information arbitrage to be had in different parts of the world and different people who know more about a particular risk than others. It's incredibly hard to really globally come to a decision on, given these are the set of, say, 10 existential risks, including the unknown risk, just like the set of all existential risks that we haven't really thought about, right? We don't know how to rank. That's an open problem. I would really struggle to actually rank them in that sense, because there's a massive unknown problem there.
Yeah. So how do you suggest we think about, working on different sets of X risks? Because there have been multiple efforts currently in the field where many people have tried to rank them. But at the end of the day, you'll have to have resources allocated to work on these different things. So maybe if you can give us some thoughts on how should possibly a nation state think about allocating resources, both in terms of financial resources and maybe we need, special forms of human organization and like different sets of, like maybe the short-term market forces currently is not too helpful to even consider X risks while we are, having this whole mindset of techno-optimism and acceleration. So what?
Yeah, I think the example of AI risk can kind of give you some perspective rather than give norms in that sense. So if you were to think about, you accelerating AI, in the world, currently power is kind of directly correlated with your ability to progress in AI. So you could think of cyber warfare as AI versus AI. So now you have a challenge, you have a trade-off. You as a nation state, your security is somehow tied into your progress that you can actually make. So when national security comes in, now you're willing to play much more looser, right? You might already have some regulatory frameworks that were put in place to reduce the overall risk you as a nation is willing to take in that sense. But now that you have an adversarial risk, and you think there's this question of existential risk for a nation in that sense, okay? As a nation state, what do you consider as your existential risk? You could no longer exist as a nation, right? So there's a nation that's actually threatening your existence. So as a nation state, you have an existential risk. So then your rules of the game is completely changed. And you go, you know what, our rules of the game that we have for AI is no longer valid, okay? Because there is a competitive advantage. And we could apply this to synthetic biology as well. So imagine a world where we actually have two nation states who are open and willing to actually look at the possibility of using other weaponry, right? So that, biological weaponry. So this has happened in the past. So like, it's not biological, chemical weaponry in that sense. That's why we have the agreement on use of chemical weapons, right? So, First World War, if you go back and look, the initial set of tools that were used were plural, right? And then as you go forward, you see mustard gas, it's like sophistication evolving both sides, right? So this is an open problem. It's like a problem where you have a set of rules, you agree these are a set of rules that we will kind of comply by, and then when competition sets in, somebody either assumes that to be existential or not, then all the rules of the game changes. So it's incredibly hard to really say to anybody, these are the set of the rules to play by. But if it is possible for us to collaborate, and I'll give an example why it's possible for us to collaborate. We all are still here. We still have enough of nuclear weapons in the world to clean this world over multiple times over, right? Nothing has happened yet, right? So the threat that your adversary has a nuclear weapon, and they might use it, is a good enough threat that you care about your own existence. So people collaborate to reduce the total number of nuclear weapons we have, and intercontinental the last ICBMs we had, and that was solved, right? So that's possible. So there is also this model of once everybody knows if you do this, mutually assured destruction will kick in, and nobody will be left around, right? Once that's known, then you are in a place where you have to negotiate. So that's kind of a way to think about it.
Yeah, well, I think nation states currently have the most resources to, think in terms of policies to be able to say, okay, we can think of certain strategies, maybe in a more game theoretic way to like cooperate with other nation states to do such stuff. But maybe currently some of these efforts on working on X-Risk or X-Risk research is mostly been, sort of non-profit entities funded by philanthropists. So is there a way we can decentralize the effort of working on X-Risk rather than being too dependent on a particular nation state to fund it? And can you maybe connect that to how the ZuVillage community here can maybe work on similar stuff?
Okay, so I'll start with the disclaimer and say one thing. So I was peripherally involved with the Effective Altruism bunch, and they have been one of the set of people who have been very, very active in the extra space. So I've been friends with a lot of them. That's part of the reason I have access to a lot of the research that's been done. So that's the exception and full disclosure and putting my hand up kind of thing. So everybody understands my bias. And the thing I was about to say was like, it is possible for communities to make progress in terms of certain classes of problems where you can solve, right? If the resource allocation that's required to do certain things. So if you were to think about LLMs and you were required to compete with OpenAI, you're looking at trillions. So we as a community to compete in that game, the same set of resources, do you think we can do? I'd be foolish to say yes, right? If there existed a paradigm where there's an equivalency class, so you have a problem, and there's an equivalency class of the problem where you can reduce this bigger problem to a smaller one, and the resource requirement for this small problem is acceptable or bounded, and we can get hold of it, we can find solutions to it. That would be a very interesting one. And that, I think, could be the way we could think about it. Or we could actually decompose the bigger problem into smaller problems, and we look at ways by which we could actually solve with set of resources we have access to. So, if you were to think about the ZuVillage, ZuZalu in the larger sense, we might want to look at these problems. And there are problems where there's outsized upside, meaning what I mean by that is this problem is not really looked upon. The resource allocation for this problem is an edge case. The nation states are not that interested, but for humanity and for the larger world in that sense, there could be significant. Then it might be possible for smaller communities who are much more focused on the outcome. It's like a positive outcome for everybody to look at the problem and work on it. So it might be very possible for this to happen. And you can collaborate. Like I'm pretty sure that discovery will be, I said, like social discovery, both in terms of finding other people who are there and finding the right problem and getting consensus would be much more easier. So if you were to think about this from a decentralized construct, yes, there's overhead for consensus, but you can achieve consensus really fast, right? If you were to think about consensus in a political sense, it's going to take a very long while, right? I don't want to go into examples, but let's think about the example of one nation state trying to give some aid to another nation state and trying to get a consensus in the bureaucratic framework or what an executive framework, right? The time it takes is so critical, right? And sometimes you want to take an action and it's time critical. So these are the kind of problems in that sense where a decentralized community could easily get the resources, can find the people, do resource prioritization, and definitely get results.
Yeah. Well, I think there are a lot of defensive elements that are required to be built in to mitigate such risk. I have a lot more questions, but I'm also conscious of time, so I want to throw it to the people here to see if you have questions that we can all discuss together.
What is the best framework to deal with uncertainty, unknown, informal framework?
I don't know. Okay, so I'll explain one set of things that I've actually worked on.
What was the question?
So the question that was asked was, is there a recommended mechanism to work on unknown risks? Set of all risks that's unknown. So there's this class of risks called information hazards. Information hazard is a class where the fact that such a thing exists causes risk to you, right? So I kind of look at mechanisms that are adjacent, which actually uses as black box models where you say, okay, I don't know what this is, but this is not that, okay? So that's the kind of mechanism that I would think. But again, I am not an expert on dealing with unknown risk. I would try more to play with the known risk. Even dealing with the known risk, yes, it is very possible that the set of all unknown risk possibly outweigh the risk of all known risk. And the list of all unknown risk, absolutely, mathematically, we can prove that. It will outweigh, in the mathematical sense, will outweigh all those that we know of. So it's...
Okay. Well, what do you think about frameworks where they put boundaries and probabilities in the limits? That's like how safety researchers now work. So they say that we keep redefining our space in which we define something until we cover the whole thing. But actually, maybe now we cover 1%, and
it's very simple. Like in physics, you talk about 3 dimensions, and you know there are people that have solutions for 21 dimensions, right? So the same thing applies here. You're looking in a dimension, you define the dimension, and in that dimension you are bounding your rest, and then you are defining the probability of that particular thing happening in the way. Okay, I'll give you a good example. So I did some work on security systems equality. So Homeland Security actually has a protocol, right? The protocol kind of, defines what the threats are and what can happen, how it can happen. And I worked with a friend of mine to look at this protocol, and we looked at the hybrid model. So we looked at the hybrid cyber synthetic bio model, right? So all the constraints they had actually put here, we could actually, it's like, you're having 2 layers over here. It's like, this layer, when you get stuck, you just walk around and go here, right? So this is literally what it is. There are a whole bunch of dependencies that probably exist in this set of whole, existential risk that we are not aware of, right? And what is effectively happening is we're making some assumptions on probabilities of these events happening because we don't know the priors. So, for example, nuclear risk, right? Now we don't know anything. Like we can't apply the normal, in the larger sense of speaking. You can't apply the normal Bayes and reasoning to say, okay, this happened, and given that we can do this. No, and there are probably a lot of other things that we don't know. So it's like if you were to think about unknown unknowns, I would say like it's a big problem, and it's not really. I don't think it's really that well studied as well. So it's like I haven't come across as much research as I would say like AI risk or other ones. So please.
I imagine there are probably some useful frameworks in, say, finance, right, that's had to deal with this problem of unknowns for many years, or... Okay,
so the way I would describe it is like pricing is the mechanism that normally, finance uses, and we have examples of catastrophic failures. Macclesfield's model and the CDOs of 2000 days is a very good example. So we do have models, absolutely, I agree, but the models assume a bunch of constraints.
I mean more like the systems and frameworks that maybe regulators have tried to put around financial institutions or banks, that don't assume models that are correct.
I'm not aware of such models in that sense. Most of the models I've come across, I've seen them assuming things, and failures have literally resulted in like a complete failure of the whole system. The best example I have is LTCM. Blackhouse shows that Merton actually was there, one of the founders, and completely failed. The Russian system collapsed, and they didn't really look at the possibility of that such a thing happening. So you wanted to ask. Please go ahead.
Yeah, maybe you mentioned it already, but imagine you have like 2 types of problem. First type of problem is like the specific problems you need to solve to mitigate risks, this X risk. And there's a multi-level where there are problems that are connected to most of the risks. I don't know, trust, complex, huge problems. Can you name, to your opinion, what's most important meta problems we need to solve that will improve our chances to solve our problems? Yeah.
The obvious one, right? Coordination problem.
Yeah.
If we could all agree. I know this sounds like the obvious way to think about it. I'm not joking. Getting consensus on, we could just coordinate the humans. And this is where I think the highest value of decentralization kicks in, right? Like, we are able to do coordination at the lowest possible cost. It is possibly one of the, at least as a stupid guy being involved in crypto for a very long while, I'm clearly biased. I would definitely put my hand up and say, if there is anything that crypto has shown us, is that we are able to actually do coordination really fast, really cheap. And that definitely is, yes.
What do you want consensus and coordination on?
Just resource allocation to start with, or even like a ranking. You could start anywhere. When you want to bootstrap anything, you want to have, okay, what am I bootstrapping? I want to agree on X, Y, Z, 0, 0, 0. Okay? That is.
But I guess if this unknown probability actually does dwarf the known probability, then consensus might be dangerous because we work on something with false certainty, ignoring other things that may have solved the unknown unknowns. So surely just consensus that technology development is good is better than consensus that this particular X risk is the best one to work on, maybe.
Even, okay, let's think this through, right? So, okay, just like we could always say that, there are infinitely many primes, the same way you could say there are infinitely many X's, right? We can mathematically induce and by induction you can actually prove that's the case, right? But we don't have an upper bound on the risk we have. What we know, we have a couple of time bounds. Time bound is like the time humanity has for various things, right? So if you were to have a problem which has a deadline of tomorrow, the set of all humanity you have access to, set of all resources in terms of money, whatever it is, right? So like, there's always this bounding function that exists. So you are always working under a constraint, right? The way I'm saying is like, imagine you have a bunch of constraints and you have no ability to coordinate, right? So that versus a bounding constraint and some ability to coordinate, right? And I would say bounding constraint and some ability to coordinate is better than bounding constraints and no ability to coordinate. Does that make sense to you? So imagine somebody says to you, okay, if you don't come up with the answer, you're going to die, right? You better have a coordination mechanism to get as much as help you can to at least get to a consensus to a problem you have at hand. That's the way I'm thinking, like, lesser of the two evils in that sense.
There's a difference between coordination and consensus, though.
Sorry?
There's a difference between coordination and consensus.
Yeah, I mean, I was loosely speaking in that sense, but you pretty much understand where the difference between the two exists. Like in your instance, the coordination is like you want to survive, right? And you are trying to optimize everything you can do to make sure your survival happens. There is no competing two existences. You and your friend, now you need consensus, right? So like the same problem applied to two people. Now you have only one set of resources to actually achieve. Now you need consensus. Bad. So just a question of how many problems are running at the same time. How do you allocate resources when that will be consensus?
Yeah, well, thank you. We'll continue more such discussions throughout the weekend, and you can always catch up with Anish later as well. I think there was some of the elements that came up here was what happens when we have short timelines, specifically with AI. We do not have time to coordinate or reach consensus and so on because there is the techno-optimism piece. Next up we have Burns, who's going to give an introduction to the DAC philosophy of how we should probably try to think. We can fit this map of techno-optimism, but at the same time consider such risks, such as one idea was to try to say, look, there are some risks if extrapolated well can almost lead to existentialism issues for humanity. I don't think we all want to die, so maybe DAC could be one way to approach that as well. So yeah, we are on time. Thank you so much. Thank you, Anish. And,